please type them into the questions section of the GoToWebinar menu, and we will answer them at the end of the presentation. This webinar is being recorded, and I will share the link to the recording. Thank you.
Thanks, Laurie. I'd like to welcome everybody to the October 7th Crop Talk. And today on Crop Talk, we're going to be, we have Timmy Ojo on, is going to be talking to us about fall/winter weather that's going to be coming ahead of us, and also our soil moisture update, just to see where we're sitting as we're getting more and more producers looking at putting fertilizer on. And then we're going to go into a little bit of a year in review and our crop scouting panel, and go from there. So just to start with, a little bit of a crop update. Right now, we're definitely getting close to that 100% harvest done in a lot of regions. There still is some soybeans out, I would say probably more in the western side of the province than the eastern side of the province. And that is actually coming off fairly fast. The weather conditions lately have been really good for bringing those or drying those fields down, and producers have been at them for the last little bit here. So it's going to be interesting to see the last 30% or so come off, and just see if we did get any damage from fall frost. From talking to producers so far, I haven't heard or seen too many bad samples, that's for sure. So things are looking good that way. Sunflower and grain corn is starting to come off, and one of the things that's not the norm, we're talking to producers that the corn and sunflowers are close to dry, and or if they're not, they are dry, so which is a good thing, because that's going to save some money in cost of drying. And also if it's close to dry, then it's just that much easier to get them dried down and get them off. So I think we'll see when you look at and Timmy talks about the weather, we'll hopefully have some weather to get the rest of those sunflowers and corn in. Lots of corn silage being done right now. I would say that you know, if we had another week, we would be close to most of the corn silage being done as well. When you look at our harvest completion in general, we're about 88%, and that's a little bit above our 3-year average, where we're normally at 76%. So again, another good number to see when we look at what happened in the last couple of years, where we've had crop that sat out for the winter. I think we're going to have a really good chance of getting most of that crop in this year, unless something major goes wrong. So definitely good to see those numbers showing up. I guess with that, Laurie, I'm going to let you turn it over to Timmy, and we'll get a weather update here and go from there. So.
Okay, thank you, Lionel. Can you see my screen?
You bet, Timmy.
Okay, thanks so much. And yeah, welcome to today's webinar, everyone. I would be speaking briefly on the fall weather and the soil moisture update. My name is Timmy Ojo, and I'm the Agricultural Systems Modeler for the province. This is the outline of what I would speak on today. I would quickly review the current growing season, and you would notice right off the bat that I have wind, which usually isn't something we talk about a lot in terms of weather review. But I think there's something significant this past growing season, or this current growing season. And I would mention on precipitation, heat, and frost. Then I would go into looking at the fall/winter outlook for both temperature and precipitation. And I'll wrap the presentation up with update from the weather program, some of the new stations that we are building, and then looking at the fall moisture, real-time fall moisture survey. Yeah, I mentioned that typically I don't usually talk about wind as being a factor, because again, it's what it is for the most part. But this past spring, Alan Dawson with the cooperators was ask a question as to, many people felt that it seemed to be windier than normal, and he wanted to know if the data actually confirms the anecdotal observation. So I dug into the data we have for the stations we've had over the last 14 years from 2007. And I ranked them based on how much in terms of the average wind speed and the maximum wind speed. And sure enough, again, what Alan thought was actually what happened. 2020, and this data was from May 1st up until September 30. The one I showed him at the time in the spring was actually just for May and June, but I've since updated the numbers, and it actually showed that, because typically on the average, I would say Agro Manitoba on the average would receive about 12.8 kilometer per hour wind speed on the average. Again, it's going to be different at different locations, but aggregating all the data, we would have about 12.8. This year, definitely was at least 1 kilometer higher, and it was actually statistically significant. And when you look at the maximum wind speed, so that's the wind gust, it was also the highest we've seen in the last 14 years at 39 kilometer per hour. And over the last 5 years, in my position as the AgMet specialist, anytime we have wind speed greater than 80 kilometer per hour, we would typically create special maps. And this year I created at least 5 of those maps showing, again, various times when we had wind speed greater than 80 kilometer per hour. And this is one of those maps that we created. This was for the wind speed that occurred mid-June, and it actually showed some areas around Trian actually receiving up to 120 kilometer per hour wind gust at that location. So I do think that wind definitely, if you felt that it was windier than normal, your feeling would be validated with this data set. Moving on to the precipitation that we've seen, again, we create weekly maps, and this was the most recent maps. It's usually available on our website, and this, again, is the total accumulation of precipitation from May 1st up until this past Sunday. And it showed, again, in the central region and the southern interlake, we've only seen about less than 220 millimeters of precipitation. So yeah, just I would say slightly less than about 9 inches of precipitation is what we've seen. You'd notice the dark blue area around Brandon, just south of the Riding Mountain Park, and then towards the far southeast corner. And those were based on the storm event that those locations got. When you compare what we are seeing this year to what we observed last year, actually last year was much wetter than what we are seeing this year. If you are looking at the total accumulation, we do remember that most of the precipitation we got last year occurred late August and in September. So again, you take these numbers with a grain of salt in terms of looking at total accumulation of precipitation, with last year being warm, being wetter than this year, because again, I'd say about at least half of the precipitation at some location occurred to very late in the season. Anytime we have huge storm rolling through, we create special maps, and this is one of those special maps, the total 18-hour accumulated precipitation, again, for the storm that rolled in through Brandon Rivers Forest and kind of going northeastward over the lakes. And Brandon received 155, I think about 150, 155 millimeters of precipitation within that 18-hour period in late June. Before then, though, over to the southeast corner, early in June, around between June 4th and June 8th, multiple systems rolled through those locations, and I'm sure folks would remember, bridges being washed out and having some evacuations happening in some of those RMs, I think around Piney and the likes. And again, those areas, Zoder, Sprague, received over 4 inches of precipitation. when you look at the percent of normal accumulated precipitation, this is when you compare what we are seeing to the historical 30-year average. And you would notice that, again, those areas south of the Riding Mountain Park, Brandon, Newdale, Minnedosa, are the only areas, and I would say southeast corner as well, are the only areas where you have greater than 100% of normal. They've had above their historical normal. Most other areas are sitting between 70 and 90. However, the Interlake and most of the central region is actually sitting at less than 70%. So they've received, I would say, roughly half to 2/3 of the typical rainfall that they would normally receive around this period from May 1st up until October 4th. I usually get asked the question as to where can folks find the data used to create the maps, and again, the crop weather report is the place to go. It provides information on the past 7 days. That's what you have on the left column, and to the right you have the seasonal summary from May 1st. And if you take a look again at this map, so taking a look at Austin, that's the first one. The actual rainfall is at 201 millimeters, and that's why, because it's less than 220 on the map, that's why it's in the yellow kind of color display. So again, the map we create every week. You can easily find the data that drives the creation of the map from the crop weather reports. I decided to pick English just to showcase again how things kind of are different based on the year over the last 4 growing seasons. The 2020 is the one in red, and this is what I like to see towards the end of the season, when you have things drying out, like you don't want tons of rain anymore. So that's what we've seen this year at many locations. And again, Lionel mentioned the fact that harvest this year is higher than what we've seen in the last 3 years, the average of the last 3 years. And the weather definitely is a major contributor, a major factor to that, because last year we noticed what happened with having excess rain, especially in the south, towards the end of this growing season. When you take a look at, I decided to pick 3 locations that are distinct. Gardington is in the southeast, Forest or Brookdale is in the southwest, and English in the northwest. The 30-year average, again, is what you'd have as an historical average over a 30-year period. And you'll notice that at English, the chart, again, we have incremental precipitation way lower than the normal early on in the growing season. However, we did have, I would say, just incremental precipitation over time, and it almost caught up to normal towards the end of the growing season. And then again, we had the drying happening. Almost everywhere across Manitoba actually had this similar trend in terms of precipitation, except for the 2 major events that occurred again early June in the southeast at Gardington, where they received about 5 to 6 inches, and then late June around the southwest, again Brandon, Forest, Newdale, Minnedosa area, that received about 6 inches or more in those areas. And that's the main difference in terms of the trend that we saw across Manitoba. Most areas, again, for the most part, had that slight upward trend that we'd like to see, except for those, I would say, couple of storms that rolled in at those areas. And if you go on Twitter, following hashtag MB Storms, you'd see tons and tons of photos. This is photo from Plumers and from Brandon with the late June precipitation event. And again, it's definitely in the news, one in 1,000-year event, because the rain actually came hard and fast, again within an 18-hour period. Receiving 6 inches or more at some location would definitely overwhelm any system. And not just in the southwest, as I mentioned, in the southeast as well. At Falcon Lake, we had some road washout, and at Vita as well. So again, the precipitation was a major factor in this growing season. Going to the heat unit in terms of temperature, we typically would use the GDD or the CHU, that's the growing degree days, or the CONIT unit, to give us an idea of what the heat accumulation is over the course of the growing season. And this year, we noticed that, again, a few locations were below normal in terms of the amount of accumulated heat. So I would say, again, close to the US border, Manitou, Snowflake, Emerson, Altoona, Gardenton, those areas had, I would say, close to normal, just slightly less than 100%. And in the south, in the northwest as well, and southwest, some parts close to the Saskatchewan border were also less than the historical normal in terms of heat accumulation. However, this actually was warmer than last year. Last year was much cooler, as most folks would remember, in terms of the heat accumulation. So you notice just the legend going from the minimum at 89 and the maximum at 111 for this year. Last year, around the same period, the minimum was actually at 81 and the maximum was at 102% above normal precipitation. Heat unit, sorry. So moving on to frost, we did have a relatively late frost this year. The last major frost occurred on May 30th, and especially to the central and the eastern parts of the province. Some location in the southwest and northwest also did experience frost in the spring, and that was on May 30th. In terms of the first fall frost, it actually occurred overnight and early morning of September 8th, and mostly to the southwest. So again, some locations actually did got down to -5.2 degrees, and not just for an hour or two. Some locations sat at negative numbers at the frost level for 9-10 hours over that course of overnight. So again, the growing season this year, I think, as good as it is, we did have some limitation in terms of the frost date. This considerably would be considered as an early frost, although it's not outside the range of expectation, because again, 1 in every 4 years, you would expect that this frost would occur around this time of the year. And again, if you're looking at the data that drives the frost maps, you can definitely go on to the crop weather report anytime we receive late frost in the spring or early frost in the fall, which we don't hope to see, but whenever it occurs, we'll produce this special report that shows the minimum air temperature at all our the weather stations we have, and the frost duration, that's the number of hours in which the weather station reported below 0 degrees. Okay, moving ahead to the fall and winter outlook. In terms of the temperature, what should we be expecting to see for the next 3 months between October, from now in October, November, and December? It's actually interesting because it's been a while I've seen the ensemble models showing very strong agreement in terms of how the fall is going to shape up. So it's showing that we would be sitting at 60 to 70% probability of being above normal. So again, we expect that this fall, and we've actually seen that now. I'd say, again, if you look at the forecast for the next week or two, you'd actually notice that it's considerably warmer than what would be expected at this time of the year. So again, this doesn't mean that, you know, every day in the fall would be very warm. No, it just means that the probability of us being warmer than normal is actually quite great. It's at 60 to 70% chance that we will be warmer than normal. So again, I'm looking forward to seeing that. Although I would, again, for folks that want to go skiing, you may have to wait a little bit. Looking at the longer range forecast for the winter, January, February, March 2021. Again, the southeast, or I would say the eastern half of the province, is expected to be, at least the probability of being above normal, so being in the warmer than normal, is at that, you know, 40 to 50%. The western half of the province, you have equal chance of being either at normal or above normal or below normal in terms of temperature over the winter. Again, the further away you are, the less accurate you'd expect the forecast to be. So I think I would pretty much put my money on the fall forecast rather than the longer range forecast. In terms of precipitation, again, precipitation is one of those dicey things. I sound like a broken record because I say this every time. Most of the models are not really showing anything in terms of what the pathway we should be expecting to see. So we do have equal probability, equal chance of being either at normal, below normal, or above normal in terms of precipitation. So it's a good way of saying, you know, the models don't agree. So you can pretty much flip a coin, and whatever you choose is very similar to what the models are saying. And similar to the fall, the winter as well, again, most parts are showing nothing except just, I'd say, in the northwest, you do have, I'd say, north central, west central, I should say, you do have a very slight chance of being above normal in terms of the snow accumulation that we would likely see between from January to March. So I would say, again, from this forecast, I would say the main take-home point is that this fall we are expecting to see above normal temperature, and it's quite a strong indication, not just at 40%, it's at 60 to 70%. So but then in terms of the longer range for both temperature and precipitation, it's pretty much anyone's guess. So going over to the Manitoba Mesonet update, the weather program, I'm sure most folks are familiar with what we've been doing over the last little while. Since 2014, we've been expanding the number of weather stations we have in the province up until 2017. Right now we sit at 108. In 2018 and 2019, we focused more on calibration and also doing mostly upgrade to our existing stations just to make sure that we have uniform standard across the network. So in this year, when I presented in the spring, I had mentioned the fact that we are looking at building 13 new stations for this year. And we are actually on, well, I shouldn't say, ideally we would have been on track, but just like everyone else, COVID kind of threw a wrench into our plans. So this year we have installed the station at Riverton. That's the one of 13 stations we wanted to install. So this picture is the construction at Riverton. The station is up and running. It was constructed early last month. The data is available internally. It's not available to the public yet. We typically, after building a new station, we usually just do about 2 to 3 months of internal review to make sure that the data is what it should be before we release the data out to the public. So you wouldn't see this on our website yet, but I would say sometime next month in November, once we validate all the data sets coming in from the station, the information will be available to check. So Riverton is one of the stations in the interlake that we intend to install. We are planning, again, if the forecast holds off, we are planning to install another station, a station at Stead and at Miami. So those are the 2 other stations that we may possibly be able to install if everything holds off later this year. Otherwise, next year we would continue, but at least we have funding for 13 new stations. One is already constructed, and we are hoping over the next 3 years to have all 13 built. This Riverton station, oh yeah, it's showing the data this morning at 8 a.m. So yeah, it's up and running internally. We would include all the new stations on our current viewer page as well. This is the page where you go to see what is happening across the network. You can click on any tab up here to really see what's happening. It's updated every hour. I should mention that all our weather stations are currently updating every 15 minutes from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. However, overnight, they switch to hourly reporting schedule so that we can conserve the battery at those locations. From November, the 15-minute schedule would actually stop and we would go back to hourly schedule throughout the day, because again, in the winter, we do have less daylight, so we don't have the batteries charging up as they would normally do in the summer. So that's what you can be expecting. However, by March and April, we would switch back to the 15 minutes reporting during the day. Okay, the last aspect I have is on the fall soil moisture survey. Historically, this is what we've done. We've had about 10 to 15, very wonderful and amazing Manitoba agriculture staff go out to various locations to take soil sample and send it back to us, and we create these soil moisture survey results. However, from last year in 2019, we started going automated, so just using the sensors that we've installed at the location. Before we did that though, in 2018, we compared what we have from the sensor to what our staff were taking, and the results were very comparable. So it gave us a very good feeling that, yeah, we can definitely go fully automated. And so this was the result from last year, the map from last year. Again, it's not surprising because we had the late rain and the late precipitation that occurred pretty much across the province. So it was all blue, almost at 100% available soil moisture at most location. This year would likely not look like that. This is the map, and I should mention this is the map for the top 30 centimeter on October 4th. So that was on Sunday. The map would be quite different if I were to draw the same map today, because we did receive some precipitation in the last 24 hours at some locations. So this map is very dynamic in terms of it can change. So I always tell folks, when you're looking at the map, it may not be representative of the specific field condition where you are at. It presents a regional information. Because I've had folks giving us feedback with regards to the fact that their location is showing as dry, but then their field is very wet. It's because, again, this map is only giving you a regional sample of what's happening at the weather station location that has been extrapolated. And it's also giving you the information relative to saturation. So saturation is 100%, and that assumes the entire soil is completely saturated with water. We typically would have that in the spring, again, after snow melt, usually the soil is saturated. So this first map is for the 0 to 30 centimeters, the top layer. When you look at the old profile, the 0 to 120 centimeter, it's actually not as dry, because again, some locations actually do have still have quite a bit of moisture down at depth, at the 1500 centimeter depth. So it doesn't look as dry as the surface soil moisture map. So again, part of what we would continue to do this until this location starts freezing up, and then one of the advantages of going with the sensors is that we know the specific time and the specific moisture content at which each station actually freezes up, compared to what we've done in the past, in which our, again, diligent staff goes towards the end of October, early November, take a sample, but it could possibly be that we have some precipitation that occurred after the sample had been taken, or we do have another warming trend that occurred that actually evaporates more of the moisture. So this gives us a very specific snapshot of what's happening at the time we want to look at. And we receive data every hour from these weather stations and from these soil moisture sensors as well. With that, that's what I have. I want to thank all the folks that work with the AgWeather program, and I'll be happy to take any question.
Okay, there is a couple questions, Timmy. The first one is there any plans for stations going up in the Emerson area?
No, not in the Emerson area, because the Emerson area currently has quite a bit of stations. One of the things we try to do is to make sure we complement what the Environment Canada stations are providing, although they don't have soil moisture and soil temperature sensors at their station. But because there is a station currently at Emerson and at Gretna, and for Environment Canada, so we consider that area already well serviced. in terms of weather monitoring. So no, we wouldn't be installing any around Emerson.
Okay. Next question is hearing talk again on the weather regarding La Nina and El Nina. Could you maybe first say what each one does and what are they saying is which one's coming this winter?
Yeah, thanks for that. So basically, again, the El Nino is when you have the surface sea temperature being, at least for 3 months, being consistently above 0.5 degrees deviation. So let's assume 0 is what you would expect to see. If the temperature is warmer by 0.5 degrees or more for 3 months, that's when you have an El Nino period. And La Nina is the reverse, when you have the surface sea temperature being cooler by 0.5 degrees or more, so that's minus 0.5 degrees or less than that, then you'd have a La Nina period. Now, historically, we expect that with El Nino, again, it typically would bring warmer than normal winter to us in the prairies, and La Nina would typically bring cooler than normal. So again, it will be colder, is what typically occurs. Now this year, or currently I should say, the last report from NOAA, it's actually showing that we are in the La Nina phase, but it's a weak La Nina phase. So again, we are still waiting to see if the weak La Nina phase actually evolve into what we call ENSO neutral. So the neutral is when you have between that minus 0.5 and plus 0.5 deviation. So that would be the ENSO phase. And at that ENSO neutral phase, again, historically, we would expect to see, I would say, just a typical winter weather. So that would be my response to the El Nino and La Nina. So right now we are in a I would say in a La Nina phase that is not really intense.
Okay, and regarding the weather we've been seeing in Calgary this year with a lot of more storms and looking at the jet stream, is that going to be changing or what should we be expecting there?
Yeah, so jet stream is one of those things that it's really hard to predict in terms of what we'd likely see. And but one thing with jet streams again is when they actually drop over us, it's again brings the cool weather from the Arctic, and we experience colder than normal winter. But again, in terms of the trajectory of the jet streams and how it flows, it's one of those things that are quite hard to predict. Now, again, saying that this fall, again, October, November, December would be warmer than normal doesn't mean that every day of those 3 months we would always be warmer than normal. It just means that on the average, that's what we would see. But in terms of the jet stream, the trajectory is really hard to predict specifically. Yes, Calgary has received, again, tons of storms, hail, and again, we know that the mountain effect is definitely in the works. And sometimes even right here in Manitoba, we do still feel, the aftermath, the effect of those storms. Sometimes they weaken before they get to us, and occasionally they've actually picked up storm, again, depending on the convection that is happening. But which related to jet stream specifically, I would say that's really hard to predict in terms of what's going to happen, I would say, day by day or even over the course of the winter.
Okay, great. Thanks, Timmy. That was some good information and another good update. And hopefully we're going to be a warm winter instead of a cool winter. So with that, Lori, I think you could turn the screen back to me. And we're going to go into the crop scouting panel. And something a little bit different this week. I thought it would be a good opportunity to go through the panel and just see what they felt was some of the issues or things that were important this year for the growing seasons. And Lori, I'm going to ask you if Dave is still on.
He sure is, and he is unmuted. If you want to unmute yourself, David, you can go ahead.
We've got one more to do.
Sorry,
Yeah.
if I can interrupt for a second. Hello,
Hi, David.
I missed the question.
Oh, just was wanting you to talk about what we did earlier on this morning about your update as to some of the disease issues that were more an issue this year.
Sure. Well, except for the heavy precipitation events that Timmy mentioned, I would say that much of the province experienced another dry growing season. And of course, that often results in fewer disease issues. It was a pretty quiet year again. A couple of things that have a lot of people talking are, first of all, verticillium stripe in canola. And that looks just like a grayish discoloration on the outside of the stems. Often seems to appear later in the season. And there will be some shredding of the outside tissue, which some people might mistake for one of the symptoms of sclerotinia stem rot in canola. But again, there's the darker color rather than white. And if you open up those stems, you'll probably see little black dots inside. Those are microsclerotia, which are resting bodies. And that's how the fungus survives from year to year. Now, being so small, I don't imagine they survive very long. So it's only in a tight canola rotation that you should see this building up. And we're not sure yet the yield impact that it might have. I suspect that it might be very much like a gray stem or weakly virulent blackleg, which is now known as Leptosphaeria biglobosa. And both of those, again, appear late in the season and don't seem to have a significant effect on yield. They may weaken the stem a little bit, so you might have more lodging than you otherwise would, but that's neither here nor there. The other disease that there was a lot of chatter about this year was bacterial blight in wheat. Normally we see bacterial blight in oats, and that's a different organism. And this year, particularly in one variety, there seemed to be bacterial blight in wheat, unlike what we've seen in the past. Scientists across the prairies have seen it occasionally, but never seems to be a big issue. Breeders don't know of a source of resistance to this bacterial blight. And again, it was really noted on one particular variety, and it's a variety that's only been out on the market for 2 years. And overall, it has gained one of the top positions in terms of acreage sown. And that often, with other crops and other varieties, reveals the works that a particular variety might have. So again, we don't know a lot about bacterial blight in oats, but it certainly has caught people's attention, and I'm sure the research community will be working on that in the future. That's about it.
Okay, great. Thanks for joining us, Dave, and thanks for being on the panel.
Okay, thanks, Lionel.
Okay, so we're going to go back a couple slides here. I'm going to ask John Hurd and Marla to maybe give a little bit some of the things that they've been dealing with this year.
Ladies first, Marla, you talk about the ruts.
Thanks, John. Yeah, so I think the biggest thing that we were seeing this year that was showing up kind of consistently in some situations throughout the growing season in terms of potential for yield and crop growth is issues related to soil structure. Last year being very wet and having those ruts in place from the previous fall during harvest, and then even carrying into the extreme wet moisture conditions that we were dealing with in the early spring, where working the soil, planting into the soil, any kind of management or activity within the soil in the early spring when it was still wet was causing a lot of problems with smearing and causing clotting and all sorts of crazy issues. And if you were lucky, you got just enough rain to mellow out some of the problems after they occurred, so after seeding. And if you were unlucky, as many people were, you didn't get the rain, or you got way too much rain and it added to the problem by causing crusting on the surface following that yet. So that would be the biggest thing, I think. I mean, when we talk about soil management and maintaining soil structure or building soil structure, these are long-term things. These aren't the type of issues that you can solve really quickly. They're really taking a step back and looking at your cropping system and seeing where you can make minor improvements potentially in order to take advantage or make it a major advantage, let's say, in building soil structure. But it's never something that we can fix in the short term really, really fast. So, I mean, that would be my biggest message. I think we saw some of the limitations, but again, Mother Nature is what threw a little bit of the wrench at us that highlighted or showcased some of these problems that we have. And some years we're really lucky and we don't see the issue because we have that perfect amount of soil moisture when we're managing the land. So that's what I have to say to kind of wrap up what we were seeing this year. John?
Yes. In fact, just yesterday I finished combining some or some hand samples anyways, where we went into some fields that had been badly rutted last fall, actually during potato harvest, and corn was planted this year. And it's quite obvious that compaction in those wheel tract areas was causing potassium deficiency and stunting, and that the yield results are in not so badly trafficked area, 120 bushels the acre, and in those compacted rows where the trucks were driving and probably getting dragged through the wet spots, down to 45 bushels the acre. So even though there was a lot of spring tillage to fill in ruts and work the soil out, that injury was still there. And yeah, hopefully we had enough dry conditions this year and shrink swelling with the that I think that we set ourselves up. We remediated much of that compaction that last year saddled us with.
Okay, so now I'm seeing producers. I was by a field yesterday where a producer was pro-tilling or some type of pro-till type unit, just the sprayer tracks or the air seeder tracks in the field. Should he be looking at doing something different, or is that going to help?
Well, I guess it depends on what those tracks are looking like in terms of what the overall intent of using the pro-till or some, whether it's high-speed vertical tillage or any kind of tillage through those tract areas. If there are ruts that are left behind and the intention is to kind of smooth out the surface of the soil in order to prepare that seed bed again, that's one thing. And that is something that then could be effective by a very light tillage activity to even out that soil surface. If the intention is to actually break up or fix the compaction that might be occurring in an area where those tracks are, that it's not rutted, so it's not about trying to smooth out a seed bed, it's trying to break up that compaction underneath. That is a little bit of a different issue and not necessarily going to be fixed easily by light surface tillage. Because those tracks and that compaction underneath that track can actually push down pretty deep. And so surface tillage isn't necessarily going to do it. So if it's just a matter of, again, smoothing over a rough seed bed, that's one thing and that's fine. You want to go in with very light tillage in that case in order to kind of smooth it over. And you also want to make sure that you're doing it while it's nice and dry. because if it's moist when you're trying to smooth those ruts over, you're just causing more compaction where you're traveling. And so when it's dry, the soil is going to have the ability to kind of carry the weight of the equipment better and not be compacted in that case.
Okay, good. Thanks, Marla. John, Timmy was talking about some warmer weather over the next little while here. I've seen some anhydrous units going. Soil temperatures have gone down, but if it warms up, will the soil warm up again, or should we be watching what the soil temperatures are?
Oh, well, a good question. And yes, no, I don't know the answer other than the trend is down. And usually after Thanksgiving, once we're through mid-October, it generally is below that kind of target temperature of 10 degrees C and declining. And once we get to that, those temperatures, then we would not see a lot of ammonia converting to nitrate. So, you know, we often think that that's kind of the target for safe application. Prior to that date, and hopefully up to this point, you know, science has developed these nitrification inhibitors or controlled release products to help chemically delay nitrification, and we should be exploiting and using some of those. Although I have done some pricing, and does look like, you know, the protected sources are about 30% more expensive than bare naked urea or anhydrous ammonia. But, you know, we do that to reduce our risk of losses. And also, Lionel, it's good for the environment. Seems to be these nitrification inhibitors actually reduce some of the nitrous oxide emissions. And so you might get a gold star, not much more than that, but a gold star or a pat on the back for helping reduce greenhouse gases should you use those nitrification inhibitor products.
What about dry soil right now and putting on NH3?
Yeah, that's a challenge that I didn't think that we were going to deal with, but last week I was actually putting out a trial with a farmer on some heavy clay here towards Sperling area, where we were actually comparing two of the new, well, one very old nitrification inhibitor, N-Serve, and one much newer one, and I can't remember the name right now, from Centuro, I believe. And we were putting that down with anhydrous ammonia, injecting at about a 4-inch depth, and the clay was working up into some pretty serious looking clods. There's moisture there. There's enough moisture to hold ammonia, but the problem often is that we don't have good soil tilth, which means we get not good sealing behind the slots. If we have trench or big clods and big voids between those clods, that's where we might find that the ammonia is not being captured or held. And so our guidelines, recommendations for that is as patiently as you can, wait for some moisture to improve the soil tilth. Another option is to do some pre-tillage. If you're doing that, then you have some, you fractured the soil a bit, and you should have some smaller smaller pieces of soil that will flow back and flow better and seal it, or to apply deeper. But putting ammonia deeper into already really dry clay soil sometimes just creates bigger clods. So those people on lighter soils, not so much a problem, that they're more likely to get a good seal. But the challenge is for those on the clay soils, and usually patience, waiting for a little bit of moisture is the approach to use.
Okay, thanks, John. Next one I'm going to ask is to John Gavlowski. What did you see this year that was maybe one of the issues that we should be concerned about, or I guess maybe caused the most problem?
So we really had 4 big issues insect-wise. Flea beetles, cutworms, armyworms, and grasshoppers. Now, instead of covering all 4 of those and keeping you here past supper, I thought what I would do is just pick one of them and go over what we saw and why the populations we were seeing. So actually, if you are able to give me the screen, I've got a few slides prepared.
Okay.
So, okay, so can you see my screen there?
You bet.
Okay, awesome. So, so I'll cover grasshoppers and what happened and why. So,
excuse me, John.
Yep.
Can you go to slideshow presentation, please?
Okay.
No worries. From the beginning on the far left.
Perfect.
That's better. Okay, cool.
Perfect.
We'll go with that. So, yeah, as mentioned, we had some, I'll call them increasing populations of grasshoppers. And now when I talk grasshoppers, we've got 180 species in Canada. We had 2 species that really we saw big increases over the past few years. That's two-striped grasshopper and somewhat clear-winged. Now, there's a difference between these. Clear-winged is a grass specialist. So areas where that was a bit more dominant, it was more the cereals, forage grasses that were being affected. Two-striped is a generalist. They will feed on lots of things. So they do prefer things like your cereals, some of your pasture plants, but when we get into later season in particular, and some of their favorites start getting harvested or drying down, they will move into canola, soybeans, things like that. So they were our dominant species this year. And as a result, we had a lot of field edge spraying going on early on. We had whole field spraying, quite a bit of it actually going on throughout the season. And I guess on a positive note, we did see some fungal infected grasshoppers in July, but I don't think the pathogen really took off in the population. I think things just got a bit too dry for that pathogen to really spread. And just to give you an idea of what's been happening with our grasshopper populations, we do annual forecast maps, and we're just mapping the data for this year for the 2021 forecast now. But you can see here what's happened. Anything green on the map means lower risk. When we start to get into the yellows and oranges, it's a bit of a higher risk. And you can see what's happened starting in 2019. So the 2019 forecast, that would be our 2018 counts. So starting in 2018, we started to see some higher populations. So we've had 3 years now where we could really see these populations building. And the 2021 map, I'm sure will have at least an equal amount of yellow and orange as the 2020 forecast. So they are building. Now, one of the reasons is weather related. Grasshoppers do better under hot, dry conditions. If we have a warmer, dry fall, it means they can lay their eggs a bit longer, and there's a bit more embryonic development in those eggs, meaning they hatch a bit quicker the next season. So we have had good egg laying conditions for our grasshoppers this year, so we can anticipate there should be a fair amount of eggs in the ground. Winter weather, you need roughly about -15 where the eggs are to kill them. And we usually don't get that. A little bit of snow cover will insulate them enough that we don't get that. And also keep in mind, when you're harvesting your cereals and things, the grasshoppers aren't going to hang around and lay eggs in those fields. They move off to the ditches and things, areas where there's lush green vegetation to lay their eggs. So those areas often get a lot of snow cover, and we usually don't count on there being high winter kill. So a lot will depend on spring weather events and natural enemies, and I won't get into that too much just to keep this briefer, but at our Hort School webinar on Thursday, we'll be covering the effects of weather on grasshoppers in a lot more detail. A few predators that we did see in higher numbers this year that will feed on grasshopper eggs. I did see a fair number of bee flies. These look like bumblebees almost, and they lay their eggs next to grasshopper eggs. Very young, eat grasshopper eggs, so good to see a lot of those, or at least their population seems to be building. Also, the black blister beetle. Blister beetles that are black or gray, they do the same thing. They're laying their eggs next to grasshopper egg pods. The larva of this species of blister beetle feeds specifically on grasshopper eggs. So although you might not like them nibbling on your canola petals and things, they're not really a pest of canola, and they do eat grasshopper eggs. And field crickets too will dig up grasshopper eggs and eat them. We certainly had lots of those around. And as mentioned, the fungus, it can take a population down, but it relies on damp, humid weather to really build up in that population and knock it back. We did see some of it in early July, but later in the season, it really didn't spread to really epidemic levels like I'd kind of hoped it might. So going into next year, anticipate grasshoppers again. It will.
Hey, thanks, John.
Yeah.
Lori, if you can give my screen back. Next, we'll go to Anne. Anne, what issues or any concerns do you have going into next growing season, or things you've seen this growing season?
Sure. I'd kind of echo what David had said earlier, where we didn't see a lot of big issues for cereals this summer. Some of the ones that we did see were the grasshoppers were obviously more of an issue, and a lot of people were talking about grasshopper damage and control. And the bacterial blight in wheat, that became more of an issue after harvest, when some farmers had realized just how much that infection had damaged their wheat yields. So, because of the reduction in wheat yields that some farmers saw because of bacterial blight, I think it'll be more of an issue going forward, perhaps throughout this winter, so that farmers can, figure out what the best options are moving forward and what they need to do to reduce that effect. And I just wanted to say that I think due to people still combining in the spring and what people might have thought would have been a late seeding, we actually saw seeding get off to a good start this year. Crops developed nicely, and I think a lot of farmers are combining corn right now, and that's probably one of the surprising things, is that corn is coming off fairly dry, and it's early October. I think harvest was starting for corn farmers in like the last week of September, so I think that was a really positive thing for this year, and maybe a surprise that next year we should be in a better spot for getting seeding done at a good time, getting the crops in early. So that's all I have to say.
Okay, well, thanks, Anne. Dennis Lang, any comments?
Sure. You want to share my screen there, Lionel?
You bet. Lori?
Okie dokie. I guess the only real big concern that we had this year, there was a little bit of IDC through the season, but nothing that was, any issues. Probably the biggest thing that I wanted to talk a little bit about is the frost damage this year. There were lots of calls on in early September. September 8th is when that frost hit in the west in the Hamiota area. So what I did is I had to look at the maturity notes from our Hamiota site. So our Hamiota site was planted on May 16th. The frost hit on September the 8th, which represents 116 days. So 116 days, typically you think, oh, well, that's lots of time. But if you actually look at, here's some of the maturity notes that were taken just right after the frost here. This glass column here is where some of the beans were at that stage when the frost hit. Now, the slide on the background is just a background slide, but just to kind of give you an idea, we try to shoot for 95% brown pod for fully mature plant, where the plant is brown, seeds are fully mature, no leaves left. So there were lots of varieties in that trial that were still in that 80% yellow pod stage, and even a little bit later in that's 50% yellow pod. I'm still waiting for samples to come in. The plots have been harvested, and so far I think we may have dodged a bullet. I think the plants were far enough along that we did not see any significant frost damage in our plots. The Dauphin site was planted on May the 15th, and we had a killing frost on September the 17th. So that's 127 days. We still had some varieties that weren't fully at 95 brown pod at that site as well. So I guess this is a cautionary note for growers planting soybeans next year. You can see here the seeding dates at these 2 sites were not late by any means, but really pay attention to your varieties going into next year, making sure that you're picking those early season varieties for the folks in the West to make sure that, and make sure you get your beans in and on time. So May 15th, generally any time in May is fine, but this is one year that we did have a frost. Now, there were a few pockets around Manitoba that I've been getting a few calls on where growers have had that issue with green seed, and but overall, I think we've dodged a bullet from this year. But I think at the end of the day, we're going to see once we get the yield numbers from Hamiota and Dauphin to see, if there was a yield reduction or not. I'm suspecting there's probably not this year. I think we're far enough along that for the most part the beans are okay. But Lionel brought up a good point in an email he sent me. He said $12 soybeans at good yield. So if you're 40 plus, that's a pretty attractive number for a lot of growers. And so just have a little cautious on how you go ahead with soybeans, just making sure that you are planting the correct variety for your region. And this year, we had a frost. Some areas maybe a little early, but you know what? It was still a frost that could have been more devastating, if the varieties were planted a little bit later. And I guess that's the thing. If you're planted on time, I think you made it okay. But if you're pushing that late May window, then in the West and in other pockets, then you could end up with a little bit more frost damage this year. So that's about all I had to say on that. So.
Okay, well, thanks, Dennis. Laurie, if you could give the screen back. That was a good point regarding, I think it was a couple years ago where we ran into that problem where our acres increased quite a bit, and field selection or frost is something we need to be always something to keep in the back of our mind. Okay, we had that. So now I want to thank the panel for doing this year. This is going to be the last broadcast for Crop Talk this year. We're looking at doing some other sessions later on, but for the weekly one that happens every Wednesday, this will be the last one. So I'd like to thank the panel. They provided us with some really good information, and we're always there to give a hand with new topics and just to helping identify stuff. And the big thing is it's usually on short notice. So thanks again, panel. You guys did a great job. From there, just a few closing slides. Again, I wanted to mention the environmental farm plan workshops that are still going on. There's the dates for till I think till the end of the year, and Tammy Watson is your contact person. The hay listing is something that's still very important for some areas. So if you've got hay for sale, or if you've got are looking for hay, contact your local office, or there's the toll-free number as well. Our extension specialist in the south, or in Manitoba, again, a real good information source for me when I'm developing these webinars. They let me know what's going on in the province, and so we can cover as many topics as we can. And like I mentioned before, a lot of the times it's done on short notice, so a lot of work is done that way. Lori Forbes, you hear her at the beginning, but boy, if you want somebody that can handle little problems at the beginning or through a webinar, she's always on top of things. So I'd like to thank her. And thank you for attending. We had great attendance this year. And like I mentioned before, we're working on some other things throughout winter here that we'll be able to get a hold of you. And if you're interested in some of the topics, please come back and join us. So I guess with that, I'd like to thank all the presenters, the panel, and again, thanks for attending.